This presentation is on the new EU Good Distribution Practices Guidelines 2013/C68/01, which was published in the Official Journal of the European Union on the 7th of March 2013. These guidelines are based on Articles 84 and 85b of Directive 2001/83/EC. So why do we need these new guidelines, and why are they far more detailed than the outgoing document which was in circulation for nearly 20 years? Well, the landscape of the pharma industry supply chain has changed considerably over the past 2 decades. With products going off patent, there has been a significant increase in the generics market. Here there is a greater need to reduce costs and improve efficiency. The result is the outsourcing of manufacturing and distribution. Therefore, there are many more players in the industry, all offering an interesting variety of services. With the number of different contract sites involved in the sourcing of raw materials, APIs, manufacturing, packaging, storage and transportation of just one product, this can lead to poor communication and improper handling of medicines, resulting in poor quality of product and an inefficient supply chain. The risk of counterfeit products or falsified medicines easily entering the legitimate supply chain is therefore increased. Just to put some things into perspective, the World Health Organization says more than 1 in 10 products in developing nations are fake. Also, research suggests that 1/3 of malaria drugs are counterfeit. However, in developed countries, medicine safety is better. However, substandard and falsified drugs still cause thousands of adverse reactions, leading to some deaths. Just recently, in the US, contaminated drug supplies caused an outbreak of meningitis that has so far claimed 16 people's lives. Also, the EU Commissions had published and made effective in January this year the Falsified Medicines Directive 2011/62/EC. So this is a timely issue of these new guidelines, so that we have a greater control over the entire supply chain in minimizing the risk of counterfeit medicines entering the supply chain, whether it be through sourcing of the raw materials and APIs right through delivery of the finished product to the customers. Here we'll be comparing the old and the new EU Good Distribution Practice Guidelines to see where we were and where we are now as a snapshot. The old guidelines 94/C63/03 was a short document which is very brief and left to interpretation. There were no chapters within that document. There was also no reference to the responsible person, so there was no one identified as taking overall responsibility for the provisions of GDP. The guidelines were also applicable to a part of the supply chain, primarily wholesale warehouses and downstream supply of finished products to customers. The new guidelines consist of 10 clear chapters which are far more detailed, and there's a reference to the responsible person within the chapter on personnel, which details their roles and responsibilities. The new guidelines applies to the entire supply chain, so it's supplying of raw materials and APIs through to intermediaries and supply finished products to the customer. The additional chapters in the new guidelines are quality management, operations, contract operations, transportation, and specific provisions for brokers, and we'll briefly touch on those over the next couple of slides. The new guidelines also brings in elements of good manufacturing practices, which were traditionally within the pharmaceutical manufacturing arena, which are now being applied to GDP, specifically on incidences, deviation reporting, CAPAs, corrective and preventative actions, change controls, and risk management. The draft EU GDP Guidelines was issued in 2011 for consultation. That consultation period ended in December of that year. There were many comments received from industry, in particular manufacturers, distributors, and the regulatory agencies. A lot of their comments were praises for the new guidelines, which were far more detailed that they were pleased to see, and also there were some concerns with regards to certain areas of the new guidelines, in particular the transportation, the responsible persons duties, and returns. So we will touch on those briefly in the next slide. However, The new published guidelines still has 10 chapters. It's very similar to the draft document with a few rewordings to take on board some of the comments from the consultation period. Here we'll highlight the key areas for consideration on the new EU GDP guidelines in comparison to the draft document that was circulated in the consultation period, where certain comments and concerns were raised, and also looking at the new sections and how we will benefit from having these new sections in place. The new guidelines indicates that the responsible person should fulfill their responsibilities personally and should be continuously contactable. The responsible person may delegate their duties but not their responsibilities. And it goes into a lot more detail on the duties of the responsible person, what their job description should cover, and also what their qualifications should be to be able to perform the task of an RP. And this is all detailed in section 2 on personnel in the new guidelines. With regards to transportation, this is a whole new section now in the new guidelines. It was also in the draft documentation for consultation. There were a number of concerns raised in this particular section of the guidelines, and in particular the draft document mentioned that where medicinal products are held on the premises of a hub for longer than 24 hours, these will be deemed to be acting as a storage site and required to obtain a wholesale dealer license. Now, the published guidelines does not mention the requirement for a WDL for a hub. However, it does indicate that provisions should be made to minimize the duration of temporary storage while awaiting the next stage of the transportation route. It also goes on to mention risk assessing the delivery routes where temperature controls are required. Again, on another point with regards to transportation, it mentions in the draft document that where hubs are utilized, these should be audited and approved prior to their use. The published guidelines does not mention auditing of hubs. However, it does mention that in section 7.2 that the frequency of audit should be defined based on risk depending on the nature of the outsourced activity. It also mentions in section 9.2 that where the temperature routes includes unloading and reloading or transit storage at a transportation hub, particular attention should be paid to temperature monitoring, cleanliness and the security of any intermediate storage facilities. So this indicates hubs will need to be assessed by an appropriate method on at least the areas of temperature, cleanliness and security. Outsourced activities is a new section in these published guidelines. It clearly indicates the responsibilities of the contract giver and contract acceptor, and mentions that a contract should be in place, ideally a quality agreement, to detail the provisions of GDP that are applicable to the work being carried out by that contracted service provider. On returns, the draft document mentioned that products returned from customers that do not hold a wholesale dealer license should only return to sale stock if they were returned within 5 days of original dispatch. This raised a lot of concerns, especially about specifically stating the number of days in which a product should be returned within. So the new guidelines now mentions that products should only be returned to saleable stock if they are returned within an acceptable time limit, for example 10 days, and has been demonstrated by the customer that the medicinal products have been transported, stored and handled in compliance with the product specific storage requirements. With regards to brokers, this is a new section that was not previously available in the old guidelines. It now mentions that brokers need to be authorized by their competent authority. They need to have a quality system in place. They need to have appropriately trained personnel, and training should be documented, and procedures and processes for handling complaints relating especially to counterfeits, and also in the event of a recall how they will coordinate with their interested parties. The supplier and customer qualification, which is now a hot topic with regulators as well as with industry, on making sure that the supply chain integrity is maintained. And one of the measures of doing that is verification or qualification suppliers, so upstream, the qualification of the suppliers, and documenting those initial and ongoing checks, and also of customers downstream. So it typically could be example the hospitals or the pharmacies to which you're supplied. What are the checks that the wholesaler is doing to ensure that they're appropriately licensed or certified to purchase medicines from yourselves? This section is covered within the operations section of the new guidelines. Now, risk management is a whole new area. It's covered in chapter 1 on quality management, and it's also mentioned throughout the document in certain areas where if there is risk exposure, how is that identified, how is it tracked, how is it documented, and how are solutions identified and implemented. So this is a hot topic within the new guidelines on risk assessing processes, and it's something that industry should really use to try and work around the new guidelines, to try and find ways of justifying their processes, and also primarily assuring that the patient safety is met through their best practices. So thank you very much for listening to this brief presentation on new EU GDP guidelines. If you have any comments or any questions, please feel free to write to us at info@inglasia.com. Thank you very much for listening.